In a gleaming Boston boardroom, a disowned daughter was about to reveal her identity to the family that had rejected her. What started as a routine business meeting took a shocking turn when they came face to face with the child they'd erased 20 years earlier. Sarah Morrison-Thompson wasn't your typical pharmaceutical heiress. For 2 decades, she had built a biotech empire, known for her brilliant determination. When she encountered her desperate father pleading for survival, she had no idea they were walking into the ultimate reckoning. Sarah chose revelation that would lead to either revenge or reconciliation. What began as acquisition would become redemption's last chance. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The mahogany desk between them had witnessed 1,000 victories, patent approvals that revolutionized cardiac surgery, FDA clearances that saved countless lives, joint ventures that transformed Thompson Medical Innovations from a cramped garage operation into a biotech empire spanning 3 continents. But Sarah Morrison-Thompson had never seen her husband's hands shake as they did now, sliding the manila folder across its polished surface. "It's done," David said quietly. The Boston skyline stretched beyond their floor-to-ceiling windows, 43 stories above the harbor, where container ships carried their medical devices to hospitals worldwide. Their penthouse office occupied the entire top floor of the Thompson building, a monument to 20 years of relentless innovation and sacrifice. Awards lined the walls. Photos captured handshakes with world leaders who'd benefited from David's inventions. Everything they'd built together, everything they'd earned through those brutal early years when she'd worked 3 jobs while he perfected his prototypes in their studio apartment. Sarah's fingers hesitated over the folder's edge. Something in David's tone carried an undertone she hadn't heard since their wedding day, when her father had stood in the back of that small courthouse chapel, his face a mask of controlled fury. Inside the folder, Morrison Pharmaceutical's corporate logo stared back at her. The same elegant script that had adorned her childhood, embossed on everything from business cards to the brass nameplate on her father's mahogany desk. The same logo that had been stripped from her trust fund documents 20 years ago. "David." Her voice emerged steadier than she felt. "What is this?" "The acquisition went through this morning. All regulatory approvals cleared. Morrison Pharmaceuticals is now a wholly owned subsidiary of Thompson Medical Innovations." The words hit her like ice water. Sarah's fingers traced the signature lines, recognizing David's careful handwriting beneath layers of corporate shell companies and holding entities. Meridian Holdings, Clearwater Investments, names designed to obscure the true buyer's identity. "You bought my family's company. I bought a failing pharmaceutical firm with valuable intellectual property and established distribution networks." David's tone carried the measured precision he used with investors. But his eyes betrayed something deeper. The Morrison family doesn't know who the actual purchaser is yet. Sarah set the documents down with careful control. 20 years of marriage had taught her to read the subtle tells in David's expression. The slight tightening around his eyes when he was protecting her from something. The way his jaw set when he'd made a decision he knew she wouldn't like. "Without discussing it with me, Sarah, using our joint assets, our company's resources." The words came out clipped, each one a small blade. "To buy the company that destroyed my relationship with my family." Memory crashed over her unbidden. Her father's office, all dark wood and leather, the scent of his cologne mixing with the ever-present smell of pharmaceutical chemicals from the labs below. She'd been 22, fresh from her pre-med program at Harvard, her engagement ring still unfamiliar on her finger. "You'll end this ridiculous infatuation immediately." Robert Morrison's voice had carried the same authority he used in boardrooms, the tone that had built a pharmaceutical empire from nothing. "David Thompson is completely unsuitable. His background, his prospects. Sarah, you're throwing away everything I've built for you." "I love him, Dad. Love." He'd said it like a diagnosis of terminal illness. "Love doesn't pay for medical school. Love doesn't maintain the lifestyle you're accustomed to. Love doesn't build legacies." She'd chosen love anyway, chosen David's calloused hands and brilliant mind over her father's empire. chosen a future where she'd wait tables while he worked 18-hour days in their makeshift laboratory. Chosen to be written out of her family's will, banned from family gatherings, erased from Morrison family history as thoroughly as if she'd never existed. They cut me off, Sarah said now, her voice barely above a whisper. They chose their pride over their daughter. And now you've bought them. David moved around the desk, his approach careful, as if she were an injured animal that might bolt. Sarah, I need you to understand. I understand perfectly. She stood, putting distance between them. You saw an opportunity for revenge, and you took it. That's not... David stopped, ran his hand through his graying hair. At 58, he'd grown into his success, traded his old flannel shirts for tailored suits, but she could still see the earnest graduate student who'd proposed to her with a ring he'd bought by selling his motorcycle. Okay, maybe partly, but not the way you think. Then explain it to me. Morrison Pharmaceuticals has been hemorrhaging money for 3 years. Your brother's management decisions, your father's refusal to adapt to market changes. They're 6 months from complete bankruptcy. Their employees, people who've worked there for decades, were going to lose everything. Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. So you rescued them. How noble. I rescued you. The words exploded from him with 20 years of suppressed frustration. Do you know what it's been like? Watching you pretend their rejection doesn't still hurt? Seeing you flinch every time someone mentions family? You've spent 2 decades building walls around that pain, and I've watched it eat at you piece by piece. That was my choice to make, was it? When your mother sent that Christmas card 5 years ago, the first contact in 15 years, you cried for 3 days. When we saw your father's photo in that medical journal, you stared at it for an hour before you thought I wasn't looking. You've never stopped loving them, Sarah, and you've never stopped hoping they'd come back. The accusation hung in the air between them. Sarah felt something crack in her chest, a carefully maintained barrier beginning to crumble. They made their choice. People make mistakes. Even proud, stubborn people who love their children but don't know how to admit they were wrong. David's voice softened. Your family is about to lose everything. Their company, their legacy, their financial security. This acquisition gives us leverage. Not for revenge, but for reconciliation. And if I don't want reconciliation? The question seemed to surprise him. Then we run Morrison Pharmaceuticals as a business subsidiary, and you never have to see them again. But Sarah... He paused, choosing his words carefully. What if you do? Sarah stared out at the harbor, where the setting sun painted the water gold. Somewhere in this city, in circumstances she could barely imagine, her family was struggling with the reality of their company's sale. Her father, the man who'd built an empire through sheer will and ruthless determination. Her mother, who'd always been caught between loyalty and love. Michael, her brother, who'd inherited everything she'd been denied. They don't know it's us. Not yet. The legal structure gives us time to decide how to proceed. Time for what, exactly? David moved to stand beside her at the window. Time for you to decide what you want. Whether you want to let them know who bought their company. Whether you want to offer them roles in the new structure. Whether you want to try again. And if they reject us again, then we'll have our answer. But Sarah, he took her hand, his thumb tracing over her wedding ring. What if they don't? The question terrified her more than she wanted to admit. For 20 years, she'd built her life around the certainty of her family's rejection. It had shaped every decision, every relationship, every carefully constructed piece of her identity. The successful businesswoman who needed no one. The devoted wife who'd chosen love over legacy. The woman who'd proven she could thrive without the Morrison name or fortune. But what if that certainty had been wrong? What if the family who'd cut her off had spent 20 years regretting their choice as much as she'd spent regretting theirs? I need to know everything, she said finally. Their financial situation. The company's real condition. What they've been through these past years. David nodded. I'll have the full analysis ready by morning. And David? She turned to face him, her expression serious. Next time you want to buy my family's company, we discuss it first. Despite everything, he smiled. Deal. But as Sarah looked back out at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk, she knew that the real negotiations were just beginning. Not with lawyers or corporate boards, but with ghosts she'd been carrying for 20 years. With family wounds that had never properly healed. With the terrifying possibility that some bridges, no matter how badly burned, might still be worth rebuilding. Sarah's hand tightened on the car door handle as their Tesla pulled into the Morrison-Pharmaceutical's parking lot. The building that had once symbolized power and prestige now stood like a monument to decline. Weeds pushed through cracks in the asphalt. Half the letters had fallen from the company's sign, leaving only Morrison-Pharmaceutic clinging to the brick facade. Jesus, David murmured, parking in a spot that would have been reserved for executives 20 years ago. Now it sat empty, like most of the lot. Sarah stepped out into the October morning, her breath visible in the crisp air. The building looked smaller than her memory suggested, its red brick darkened with age and neglect. Windows on the upper floors were dark, entire sections clearly abandoned. But it was the silence that struck her most. She remembered this place humming with activity, delivery trucks lined up at the loading dock, employees streaming in and out during shift changes. Now, only a handful of cars dotted the vast parking lot. "Miss Morrison?" The voice made Sarah turn. A security guard approached, his face lighting with recognition despite the 20 years that had passed. "My God, it really is you." "Frank Castellano." Sarah managed to smile. "You're still here. 38 years next month." Frank's uniform was clean but worn, his hair gone completely gray. "Though, I gotta say, not many of us left to remember when you used to visit with your dad." The memory hit her unexpectedly. Age 8, holding her father's hand as he walked through these same hallways, employees greeting him with a mixture of respect and affection. She'd been so proud to be Robert Morrison's daughter, so certain she'd follow in his footsteps. "Frank, this is my husband, David Thompson. We're the new owners." Frank's eyebrows rose. "Well, I'll be damned." When they said new management was coming in, he shook his head. "Your family know yet?" "Not yet," Sarah said quietly. Frank nodded, understanding more than he said. "Building's in rough shape, I won't lie. But the bones are good. Always have been." They followed him through the main entrance, past the reception desk where Sarah's mother used to work during college summers. The marble floors were cracked, the company photos faded and outdated. Everything felt frozen in time, but a time that had been allowed to decay. "Dr. Martinez is still here," Frank said as they walked. "She's been keeping the labs running with skeleton crew. Might want to talk to her. She's got the real story of what's been happening." Dr. Elena Martinez looked up from her microscope as they entered the research wing. Sarah remembered her as a young postdoc when she'd visited during high school. Now silver-haired but still sharp-eyed, Elena's face showed the wear of someone who'd fought a losing battle for too long. "Sarah Morrison." Elena stood, extending her hand. "I wondered if we'd see you." "Dr. Martinez. This is my husband, David Thompson." Elena's expression shifted as she recognized the name. "Thompson Medical Innovations, the cardiac device patents. Among others," David said modestly. "We've been following your work for years. Revolutionary stuff." Elena gestured around the half-empty lab. "Wish we'd had your innovation here. Might have made a difference." "What happened?" Sarah asked. Elena's expression darkened. "Where do I start?" Michael's been making decisions based on what looked good in quarterly reports, not what made scientific sense. "Your father..." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Your father became convinced the industry was conspiring against Morrison legacy. Refused to partner with other companies, wouldn't license technology, insisted we could do everything in-house." She led them to a wall chart showing failed projects over the past 5 years. Red X's marked dozens of discontinued research lines, millions in wasted investment. "The Alzheimer's drug was our last real shot," Elena continued. "Promising early results, but Michael rushed it to phase 3 trials before we understood the side effects. When it failed, we lost our biggest investors." Sarah studied the timeline, seeing her family's desperation played out in corporate decisions. Each failed project represented not just money lost, but dreams abandoned. Her father's dreams. "How many employees left?" David asked. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. We're down to 47 from a high of 300. Most of the experienced researchers found positions elsewhere. Brain drain. Elena's voice carried exhaustion and grief. The people who stayed, they stayed out of loyalty. To your father's legacy, mostly. Even though he wasn't here to appreciate it, Sarah finished. Elena nodded. Michael tried, I'll give him that. But he was trying to be Robert Morrison, instead of finding his own way. And your father, he couldn't let go enough to guide properly, couldn't step back enough to let Michael succeed. They spent the next hour reviewing financial records that painted an even bleaker picture. Debt service consuming most revenue. Equipment leases in default. Suppliers demanding payment on delivery. The company her father had built over 40 years, reduced to barely surviving month to month. The employees who stayed, Sarah asked as they prepared to leave. What are they hoping for? Elena considered the question carefully. Honestly? Most are just hoping to make it to retirement with their pensions intact. The younger ones are updating their resumes. But a few. She gestured toward the lab where two researchers worked intently over their experiments. A few still believe in what this place could be again. As they walked back to the car, Sarah felt the weight of what they'd inherited. Not just a company, but the shattered remnants of her family's American dream. Her father's legacy reduced to empty hallways and abandoned research. Her brother's failure written in red ink across 20 quarters of declining performance. But underneath the decay, she could see what Frank had meant about good bones. The research infrastructure was outdated but solid. The remaining employees were few but dedicated. And somewhere in the failed experiments and abandoned projects, there might still be value worth salvaging. What are you thinking? David asked as they reached the car. Sarah looked back at the building one more time. I'm thinking about what comes next. The next morning found Sarah parked across from a modest apartment complex in Watertown, her hands gripping the steering wheel as she watched her father emerge from the entrance. 20 years had carved deep lines in Robert Morrison's face, and his once commanding presence had diminished to something almost fragile. He moved slowly, favoring his left leg, a far cry from the man who used to stride through corporate hallways like he owned the world. Which, Sarah reflected bitterly, he once had. She followed at a distance as he walked 3 blocks to a medical building, her heart clenching as she watched him pause twice to catch his breath. The man who had built an empire now struggled with a simple walk to what appeared to be a cardiology appointment. From her car, she called Rachel Thompson. I need you to do something for me, unofficially. Name it, Rachel's voice came through clearly. Her sister-in-law's social work connections had proven invaluable over the years for understanding people's real situations. Robert Morrison. I need to know about his health, his living situation, everything. A pause. Sarah, are you sure about this? I'm sure I need to know. 2 hours later, Rachel called back. Your father had a heart attack 18 months ago. Mild, but it shook him. He's living on Social Security and a small pension. The apartment is a 1-bedroom rental. Your mother. What about my mother? She works part-time at the Newbury Gallery on Beacon Hill. Sarah, she's been there 3 years. The owner says she's overqualified but never complains, never misses a day. Sarah closed her eyes. Margaret Morrison, who had once hosted charity galas in their Beacon Hill mansion, now worked retail to help pay rent. That afternoon, Sarah found herself standing outside the Newbury Gallery, watching through the window as her mother carefully arranged a display of watercolors. Margaret moved with the same grace Sarah remembered, but her clothes were simple, practical. Gone were the designer suits and expensive jewelry that had once defined her social position. A customer approached with questions about a painting's provenance, and Sarah watched her mother's face light up as she discussed the artist's technique and historical context. There was genuine enthusiasm there, a spark Sarah rarely remembered seeing during the formal dinner parties and corporate functions of her childhood. Can I help you? Another employee had approached the window where Sarah lingered. Just browsing, Sarah managed, stepping back before her mother could look in her direction. That evening, James Wheeler's office felt like a sanctuary. The family lawyer's walls displayed 3 generations of Morrison milestones, photos Sarah recognized from her childhood home, including some that had been quietly removed after her disownment. I've been waiting for this call for 5 years, James said, settling into his chair with the careful movements of a man in his 70s. Ever since your success became too prominent to ignore. They know about Thompson Medical? Sarah, your husband's cardiac devices are used in hospitals worldwide. Your father's cardiologist recommended one for his own procedure. The irony wasn't lost on him. James opened a desk drawer and withdrew a small collection of newspaper clippings. Business Journal features. Awards ceremonies. Photos of Sarah and David at medical conferences. All carefully preserved. Your mother kept these? Your mother sent them to me, along with letters she wrote but never sent. James handed her a small bundle tied with ribbon. 20 years' worth of unsent correspondence. Birthdays, anniversaries, Christmas. Sarah's hands trembled as she unfolded the first letter, dated just 6 months after her wedding. My dearest Sarah, David seems like a good man, despite what your father believes. I hope you're happy. I hope you'll forgive us someday for letting pride matter more than love. She never stopped loving you, James said quietly. Neither did your father, though his pride runs deeper. And Michael. He shook his head. Michael has been trying to drink away the guilt of inheriting everything you should have had a share in. He's drinking? Was. He's been sober 8 months now. Attending meetings. Finally facing the fact that he was never equipped for the responsibilities your father thrust on him. Sarah set the letters down carefully. They're all broken. Broken people can heal, Sarah. But only if they get the chance. Outside James's window, Boston's evening lights twinkled like stars. Somewhere in this city, her family was struggling with their reduced circumstances, carrying 20 years of regret and pride. And here she sat, with the power to change everything or nothing. What do you think I should do? James smiled sadly. I think you should decide whether revenge or reconciliation will serve you better in the long run. But remember, you only get to choose once. James Wheeler poured tea from a china service that had witnessed decades of Morrison family crises. His law office felt frozen in time, mahogany panels gleaming under warm lamplight, leather-bound volumes creating walls of accumulated wisdom. Sarah accepted the delicate cup, noting how her hands had steadied since yesterday's emotional revelations. You've been their secret guardian angel, she said, settling into the familiar wingback chair she'd occupied during childhood visits when her parents discussed estate planning. James nodded, his weathered hands steady despite his 73 years. Small things. Legal fees when the company faced regulatory violations. Anonymous contributions to your mother's medical bills after your father's heart attack. Never enough to make them comfortable, but sufficient to prevent complete catastrophe. Why? Because I watched your father build something extraordinary, and I watched pride tear it apart. Because your mother deserved better than penury for her husband's mistakes. Because family. He gestured toward the photos lining his walls. Family matters, even when it's broken. Sarah studied a particular photograph, her college graduation, the last family portrait before everything fractured. Her younger self smiled radiantly, between parents who looked proud and brother who seemed genuinely happy for her success. Before David. Before the ultimatum. Before 20 years of silence. Show me the letters, she said quietly. James retrieved a larger bundle from his safe, dozens of envelopes in Margaret Morrison's careful handwriting. Sarah opened one from 5 years ago, her mother's voice emerging from the careful script. Sarah darling, I saw the article about David's breakthrough with pediatric heart devices. How many children will live because of his brilliance? I'm so proud of who you both became, despite our failures as parents. Your father pretends not to follow your success, but he keeps every article in his desk drawer. Another, from just 2 years past. I dream sometimes that you'll call. that you'll give us a chance to apologize properly. Michael is trying so hard to be the son your father wanted, but he's drowning. He needs his sister's strength, her wisdom. We all do. Robert knows about these letters. He knows she writes them. They argue about it occasionally, whether reaching out would be intrusion or invitation. Your father's pride battles his regret daily. Sarah set the letters aside carefully. What about Michael's recovery? James's expression softened with something approaching paternal pride. 8 months sober, as I mentioned. But more than that. He's been attending business classes, trying to understand where he went wrong. Last month, he came to me asking about bankruptcy procedures. Not for the company's protection, but to understand how his decisions affected employees. He's taking responsibility. Finally, the drinking was his way of avoiding the weight of inheriting everything you should have shared. He told me once that every decision felt like betraying you or disappointing your father. Impossible position for someone unprepared for leadership. Sarah stood, moving to the window overlooking Boston Common. Families strolled the pathways below, parents pushing strollers, children chasing squirrels. Simple moments of connection that she'd been denied with her own blood relatives. What would reconciliation look like? She asked. That depends entirely on what you can forgive and what they can change. James joined her at the window. Your father will struggle most. His pride built everything he achieved, but it also destroyed what mattered most. Your mother will want to rush back to how things were, which isn't possible or healthy. Michael will need to prove himself worthy of trust he's never earned. And me? You'll need to decide whether you can be Sarah Morrison-Thompson. Not Morrison or Thompson, but both. Whether you can hold your power without wielding it as a weapon. The weight of choice settled on her shoulders. 20 years of justified anger. 20 years of building life without them. 20 years of success that proved their rejection wrong. All of it could fuel revenge or redemption. I have a proposal, James said carefully. Let me arrange a business meeting. Thompson Medical's acquisition team meeting with Morrison family leadership about the company's future. You and David remain anonymous initially. Let them demonstrate who they've become under pressure before revealing who holds their fate. Sarah considered the strategy. It would give her family a chance to show growth without the complication of personal emotions. Let their actions speak before words clouded judgment. And if they prove they haven't changed, then you'll know reconciliation isn't possible, and you can proceed with clear conscience. And if they have changed? James smiled, the expression carrying decades of legal wisdom and genuine affection. Then you'll finally have the family you deserved all along. That evening, Sarah found David in their home office, reviewing Morrison's financial records with the methodical focus that had built their empire. Their Beacon Hill townhouse wrapped around them like a cocoon of shared success, medical journals lining the walls, patents framed between family photos, the comfortable clutter of two brilliant minds building something together. James thinks we should meet with them, Sarah said, settling into the chair across from his desk. Business meeting first. Anonymous. David looked up from the spreadsheets, his reading glasses catching the lamplight. Test them before revealing ourselves. Exactly. See who they are now, not who they were 20 years ago. And if they fail the test? Sarah had been dreading this conversation all day. Then we run Morrison Pharmaceuticals as a subsidiary and I never look back. But you want them to pass. The accusation hung between them, gentle but accurate. Sarah studied her husband's face, seeing the careful neutrality he wore when protecting himself from disappointment. David, what are you really afraid of? He set down his glasses, a gesture she recognized as preparation for difficult truth. I'm afraid they'll hurt you again. I'm afraid you'll let them back in and remember why you left us for them. Left you for them? Sarah stared at him. When have I ever? You haven't. That's not... David rubbed his temples. Sarah, you chose me over them once. What happens when you don't have to choose anymore? The vulnerability in his voice caught her off guard. After 20 years of marriage, she sometimes forgot that David's confidence had been hard-won, built over years of proving himself worthy of the Morrison heiress who'd given up everything for love. You think I'll regret choosing you? I think you'll realize what you sacrificed more clearly when you see what you could have had. Sarah moved around the desk, perching on its edge so she could see his face clearly. What I could have had was a life built on other people's expectations. What I chose was a life built on love and shared dreams. Even if reconciling with them means sharing those dreams with people who rejected them once? The question struck at the heart of her own fears. Would bringing her family back into her life diminish what she and David had built? Would the Morrison-Thompson Medical as Sarah's company or David's? Would her father's approval finally matter more than her husband's partnership? I don't know, she admitted. But I know I can't make that decision from fear. David nodded slowly. Then, we need ground rules. For the business meeting. For any relationship that follows. Before Sarah could respond, the doorbell chimed. Rachel Thompson's voice carried from the hallway as their housekeeper let her in, and soon David's sister appeared in the doorway, her social worker's intuition immediately reading the tension in the room. Family crisis meeting? Rachel asked, settling into the third chair without invitation. Good. Someone needs to talk sense into both of you. We're handling this fine, David protested. Really? Because Sarah looks like she's about to throw up, and you look like you're preparing for war. Rachel's direct gaze moved between them. What's really happening here? Sarah found herself explaining the situation, from the acquisition through James's proposal, watching Rachel's expression shift from surprise to understanding to something approaching concern. So David bought Sarah's family company to force a reconciliation, Rachel summarized. That's not. David started. And Sarah's torn between revenge and redemption, while David's terrified of losing his wife to people who treated her like garbage. Rachel's bluntness cut through their careful politeness. Did I miss anything? The silence that followed felt heavy with recognition. Here's what I think, Rachel continued. You're both so busy protecting each other from disappointment that you're forgetting what actually matters. Sarah, your husband bought a failing company and handed you the power to heal or hurt the people who rejected you. That's either the most romantic gesture in history or the most manipulative. Which is it? Sarah looked at David, seeing past his protective instincts to the man who'd spent 20 years proving his worth to a family that never acknowledged his existence. It's both, she said finally. And that's what makes it real. David's shoulders relaxed slightly. So what do? We trust each other, Sarah said. And we trust that whatever happens with my family, it doesn't change what we built together. Rachel smiled. Now that sounds like a plan worth trying. The Thompson Medical Innovations conference room buzzed with nervous energy as David's assistant, Catherine, made final preparations for the meeting. Sarah positioned herself behind the one-way glass panel in the adjacent observation room, her hands steady despite the emotional storm building inside her chest. In 30 minutes, she would see her family for the first time in 20 years. Audio check, Catherine said into her earpiece, and Sarah nodded, hearing every word clearly through the hidden speakers. David sat at the head of the polished conference table, reviewing his notes with the calm demeanor that had made him legendary in boardroom negotiations. At precisely 10 o'clock, the Morrison family arrived. Sarah's breath caught as her father entered first, moving with careful dignity despite his obvious frailty. Robert Morrison had always commanded rooms through sheer presence, but now he seemed diminished, his once broad shoulders curved with the weight of failure. His hair had gone completely white, and the hand that gripped his briefcase showed a slight tremor. Margaret followed, and Sarah felt tears threaten at her mother's quiet grace. Despite wearing what were clearly off-the-rack clothes instead of the designer suits of her corporate wife days, Margaret Morrison still carried herself with unmistakable elegance. Her silver hair was styled simply, her makeup subtle but careful. She looked like a woman determined to maintain dignity in reduced circumstances. Michael brought up the rear, and Sarah barely recognized her brother. Gone was the entitled swagger she remembered, replaced by something approaching humility. He'd lost weight, his face leaner and more serious. When he shook David's hand, his grip seemed genuine rather than performative. Mr. Thompson, Robert's voice carried its old authority despite his physical frailty. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with us personally. We understand Thompson Medical's acquisition schedule is quite demanding. Please, sit." David gestured to the chairs arranged around the table. "I believe in face-to-face discussions when possible, especially regarding transitions of this magnitude." Sarah watched her family settle into their seats, noting the subtle dynamics. Her mother sat closest to her father, a protective positioning that hadn't existed in Sarah's childhood memories. Michael took the chair furthest from Robert, not rebellion, but space that suggested a more complicated relationship than the father-son unity she remembered. "I'll be direct," David continued. "Morrison Pharmaceuticals represents both opportunity and challenge for Thompson Medical. The infrastructure is solid, but the operational difficulties are significant. We're aware of the company's current limitations," Michael said, his voice carrying none of the defensiveness Sarah had expected. "The responsibility for those limitations rests primarily with my leadership decisions over the past 5 years." Robert's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't contradict his son. Sarah found herself surprised by Michael's willingness to accept blame so directly. "What we're hoping to understand," Margaret interjected with quiet firmness, "is your vision for Morrison's future, particularly regarding the employees who've remained loyal despite our difficulties." David's expression warmed slightly. "The 47 current employees will retain their positions with improved benefits and clear advancement opportunities. Our preliminary analysis suggests the research division, while underfunded, has been pursuing several promising avenues. Dr. Martinez's work on cardiac rehabilitation protocols," Michael nodded. "She's been maintaining that program despite budget constraints. It could complement your device applications." Sarah leaned forward, surprised by the knowledge in her brother's voice. This wasn't the Michael she remembered, the one who'd coasted on privilege and charm. This version had clearly been learning the business from the ground up. "The Morrison name," Robert said carefully. "It carries 40 years of pharmaceutical innovation. While recent years have been challenging, the brand still holds value in certain medical communities. Which is why Morrison Pharmaceuticals will continue operating under its current name as a Thompson Medical subsidiary," David assured him. "We're not interested in erasing legacy. We're interested in building on it." Sarah watched her father's relief, the way his shoulders relaxed slightly at David's words. For a man who'd built his identity around the company bearing his name, that assurance clearly mattered enormously. "What role do you envision for the Morrison family in the new structure?" Margaret asked, her tone diplomatic but determined. David consulted his notes, though Sarah knew he had every detail memorized. "That depends on your interests and qualifications. We're prepared to offer consulting positions with the transition team, advisory roles in research direction, and potentially expanded responsibilities based on performance." "Starting from the bottom," Michael said, and there was no bitterness in his voice. "I understand. I need to prove I can contribute rather than simply inherit." The conversation continued for another hour, covering operational details, employee retention strategies, and timeline for integration. Sarah found herself studying her family's reactions, their body language, the way they interacted with each other and with David. This wasn't the family she'd left 20 years ago. They'd been humbled, changed by failure and loss. Her father still carried his pride, but it seemed tempered with genuine regret. Her mother had found her voice in ways Sarah had never seen. And Michael had grown up. As the meeting concluded with handshakes and promises of follow-up conversations, Sarah realized the test had revealed more than she'd expected. Her family had passed, but now she faced a more difficult question. Was she ready to pass theirs? Less than generated _story greater than part 7. The revelation. Sarah's hand trembled as she reached for the conference room door handle. Through the glass, she could see her family gathering their papers, preparing to leave with cautious hope written across their faces. David had stepped out momentarily, giving her the opening they'd agreed upon. 20 years of separation were about to collide with this single moment. She opened the door and stepped inside. The effect was immediate and devastating. Robert Morrison's briefcase slipped from his hands, papers scattering across the polished floor. Margaret's hand flew to her throat, a soft gasp escaping her lips. Michael froze completely, his pen halfway to his jacket pocket, his face cycling through shock, disbelief, and something that might have been relief. "Hello, Dad?" Sarah said quietly, her voice steady despite the earthquake happening in her chest. For 30 seconds, no one moved. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable, filled with 20 years of absence, recrimination, and carefully buried love. Then Margaret Morrison began to cry. Not the dignified tears of a corporate wife, but the raw, broken sobs of a mother who'd lost her child and found her again. "Sarah." Robert's voice cracked on her name. "My God, Sarah." "Surprise," she said, though there was no humor in it. She moved to the head of the conference table, claiming the position of power with deliberate intention. "I believe we have some things to discuss." Michael was the first to find his voice. "You? Thompson Medical is—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "Mine. Ours. David's and mine." Sarah's tone carried the authority of someone who'd built an empire from nothing. "Thompson Medical Innovations owns Morrison Pharmaceuticals as of 3 days ago. Congratulations. You've just been begging your daughter and the son-in-law you rejected for the salvation of your company." The words hit like physical blows. Robert's face went through several color changes before settling on ashen gray. Margaret's tears stopped as shock took over. Michael sat down heavily, as if his legs could no longer support him. "How long have you known?" Robert asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "About the acquisition?" 3 days. "About your situation?" "Long enough to watch you struggle. Long enough to see you lose everything that mattered more to you than your children." "Sarah, please," Margaret started. "No." Sarah's voice cut through her mother's plea with surgical precision. "You don't get to please me. Not after 20 years of silence. Not after choosing pride over family. Not after making me disappear because I dared to love someone you deemed unsuitable." She moved around the table, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor with each measured step. "Do you want to know what the past 20 years have been like? Do you want to know what it felt like to be erased from my own family's history?" "We never," Robert began. "You never what? Never missed me? Never regretted your choice? Never wondered if maybe, just maybe, you were wrong about David?" Sarah's control began to fray, 20 years of suppressed emotion bleeding through. "Because I have newspaper clippings, Dad. Business journal articles. Photos from medical conferences. Mom saved them all and gave them to James Wheeler, along with letters she wrote but never sent." Margaret's face crumpled. "You know about the letters?" "Every one. 20 years of 'I'm sorry' and 'we were wrong' and 'please forgive us,' but never actually sent. Never actually risking your pride for your daughter's forgiveness." Michael finally spoke, his voice hollow. "We destroyed everything, didn't we? The company, the family, everything Dad built." "You destroyed what mattered," Sarah agreed. "You kept the company and lost your soul. You chose business over blood, reputation over relationship. And now," she gestured around the elegant conference room, "now the son-in-law you thought was beneath your notice owns everything you spent 40 years building." Robert struggled to his feet, age and shock making him unsteady. "Sarah, I know I can't undo what we did. I know I failed you as a father. But please, your mother never wanted any of this. She fought me, argued with me for years about reaching out to you, but not enough to actually do it. I forbade her." Robert's voice carried an echo of his old authority. "I was wrong, God help me. I was completely wrong about everything, but I couldn't admit it. Every year that passed made it harder. Every success you achieved made our rejection look more foolish. How do you apologize for throwing away your own daughter?" Margaret stood slowly, moving towards Sarah with careful steps, as if approaching a wounded animal that might bolt. "You became everything we hoped you'd be, and more. You proved we were wrong about David, wrong about love, wrong about what really matters. And we were too proud and too ashamed to admit it." "And Michael?" Sarah turned to her brother, who looked like he wanted to disappear entirely. "What's your excuse?" "I don't have one." Michael's admission came quietly. "I was jealous of you, threatened by you, and relieved when you were gone because it meant I'd finally be enough for Dad. Except I never was enough, was I? I was never you." The confession hung in the air like a physical presence. Sarah felt some of her anger shift, transforming into something more complex. These weren't the proud, inflexible people who'd rejected her 20 years ago. These were broken, humbled, desperate people who'd lost everything that mattered and finally understood the cost of their choices. "So what now?" she asked, the question directed as much to herself as to them. "You need what I have. Your jobs, your security, your future. I control all of it. How does it feel to be completely at the mercy of the daughter you threw away?" The answer came from the doorway behind her, in David's quiet voice. "It feels like an opportunity for something better than revenge." Sarah turned to see her husband watching them all with the measured gaze of someone who understood exactly what this moment meant for everyone in the room. The real negotiation was just beginning. Over the next 3 days, Sarah arranged to meet with each family member separately, away from the charged atmosphere of the conference room. She needed to understand who they'd become individually before she could decide what they might become together. Her father came first, to her office on a gray Thursday morning. Robert Morrison sat across from her desk, the same power dynamic they'd shared 20 years ago, but with reversed positions. He looked smaller in the chair, diminished not just by age, but by the weight of failure. "I've replayed that conversation 1,000 times, he said without preamble. "The day you told me about David, I've imagined saying different words, making different choices." "But you didn't," Sarah replied, her tone neutral. "You chose control over connection. You chose to be right over being a father. I chose to protect what I'd built, what I thought would protect you." Robert's hands trembled slightly as he spoke. "My father worked in a textile mill, died at 52 with nothing but debt and broken dreams. I swore my children would never know that uncertainty. So you tried to control my certainty, my choices, my life." "Yes." The admission came quietly. "And I lost everything that mattered while protecting everything that didn't." Sarah studied her father's face, seeing genuine regret beneath the proud mask he'd worn for decades. "What do you want from me now?" "Nothing I deserve, everything I lost." Robert met her eyes for the first time since entering her office. "I want my daughter back. I want to know the woman you became despite my failures. I want to watch you change the world the way you've already changed medicine. And if I can't forgive you, then I'll accept that consequence. But I'll die knowing I finally told you the truth, that losing you was the greatest failure of my life." Margaret arrived the next morning with a small wrapped package. Inside, Sarah found a photo album, 20 years of pictures collected from newspaper articles, medical journals, and public events. Photos of Sarah and David at award ceremonies, conference presentations, and charity galas. A mother's careful documentation of a daughter's life from afar. "I made this 5 years ago," Margaret said, her voice soft, "when I finally admitted to myself that we might never reconcile. I wanted to remember you as you are, not as the 22-year-old who left us." Sarah turned the pages slowly, seeing her life reflected through her mother's eyes. There were articles about David's patents, photos from their wedding announcement that had appeared in business publications, even a picture of their townhouse from a medical journal feature. You kept track of everything. A mother never stops loving her child, even when she fails her completely. Margaret's composure cracked. "I should have called you after your father's heart attack. I should have reached out when we lost the house. I should have been brave enough to risk his anger for your forgiveness. Why weren't you?" "Because I was afraid you'd reject me the way we rejected you. Because I thought I didn't deserve forgiveness. Because..." Margaret paused, gathering courage. "Because I was as proud as your father, just in a different way." They sat in silence, two women separated by decades of hurt, but connected by bonds that had never fully broken. "What do you want now, Mom?" "I want to know my daughter-in-law who helped you build something extraordinary. I want to hear about your life, your dreams, your struggles. I want to be your mother again, if you'll let me try." Michael's meeting happened last, at a coffee shop near his apartment. He looked healthier than he had in the conference room, but the weight of responsibility and failure still marked his features. "I need to tell you something," he began without small talk. I've been sober for 8 months, but I've been honest for less than 1. The drinking wasn't about losing the company. It was about never earning it. Sarah waited, sensing more truth coming. Every decision I made, I asked myself what Robert Morrison would do. Never what Michael Morrison thought was right. Never what would actually help the company or the employees. Just what would make Dad proud. He laughed bitterly. Turns out, trying to be someone else is a guaranteed way to fail at everything. What changed? Hitting bottom. Losing everything. Finally understanding that I'd spent my whole life competing with a ghost. The daughter Dad lost. The son he wished he'd raised differently. Michael met her eyes. I can't compete with you, Sarah. I never could. But maybe I can learn to be worth knowing as myself. And what does that look like? Earning my place instead of inheriting it. Learning the business from people who actually understand it. Making amends to employees I failed. And he paused, vulnerability replacing his usual defensiveness. Maybe earning the right to call you my sister again. That evening, Sarah sat in her study, processing 3 conversations that had fundamentally shifted her understanding of her family. They weren't the same people who'd rejected her 20 years ago. Pain had changed them, humbled them, forced them to confront the cost of their choices. The question now was whether she was ready to confront the cost of hers. The negotiation took place in James Wheeler's conference room, neutral territory that carried the weight of family history without the emotional charge of either the Morrison or Thompson spaces. Sarah sat at one end of the polished table, David beside her in a show of united front. Across from them, the Morrison family arranged themselves with careful spacing, not the tight unit they'd once been, but 3 individuals prepared to answer for their own choices. James presided from the head of the table, legal documents arranged in precise stacks before him. We're here to establish new frameworks for both personal and professional relationships, he began. This isn't about forgiveness or punishment. It's about creating sustainable structures for moving forward. Sarah opened the folder in front of her, consulting notes she'd spent days preparing. Let's start with the business arrangements. Morrison Pharmaceuticals will continue as a Thompson Medical subsidiary, maintaining its name and research focus. The current 47 employees retain their positions with enhanced benefits effective immediately. Robert nodded, his relief carefully controlled. And management structure? That depends on demonstrated competence, not inherited privilege. Sarah's tone was crisp, professional. Michael, you'll start as a junior research coordinator under Dr. Martinez's supervision. Prove you can contribute to actual science before requesting broader responsibilities. Michael didn't flinch. Reporting structure? Performance metrics? Monthly reviews with Dr. Martinez. Quarterly assessments with David. Clear benchmarks for advancement, based on results, not relationships. Sarah appreciated that he asked about measurements rather than protesting the junior position. Margaret, your art history background and gallery experience suggest a role in our medical humanities initiative. We're developing programs that integrate arts therapy with medical device rehabilitation. Interested? Margaret's eyes brightened. I'd be honored. I've seen firsthand how creative engagement helps patients process medical trauma. Part-time initially, with potential for expansion based on program success. Sarah made a note. Robert, your pharmaceutical industry knowledge remains valuable despite recent setbacks. We're offering a consulting position focused on regulatory compliance and industry relationships. Advisory only, Robert said, understanding the limitations. No operational authority. Correct. Your insights matter, but decision-making remains with current management. Sarah looked directly at her father. Your pride nearly destroyed everything once. We won't risk that again. David spoke for the first time. These aren't permanent arrangements. They're probationary frameworks that can evolve based on trust rebuilt and value demonstrated. The professional terms established, Sarah shifted to more personal territory. Now for family relationships. I need boundaries that protect what David and I built while allowing space for whatever we might rebuild together. She consulted her second folder. Sunday dinners, once monthly, at rotating locations. No business discussions. No rehashing the past unless someone specifically requests it. No assumptions about returning to old patterns or roles. Holiday arrangements? Margaret asked carefully. We'll start small. Christmas Eve at our place this year, if everyone's comfortable. No gift exchanges beyond token acknowledgments. No attempts to recreate childhood traditions that belong to a different family configuration. What about privacy? Michael asked. Media attention if reconciliation becomes public knowledge? All family matters remain confidential unless unanimously agreed otherwise. Thompson Medical's ownership of Morrison Pharmaceuticals is business news. Our personal relationships are private. Sarah appreciated his awareness of potential complications. Robert cleared his throat. Sarah, I need to ask directly. Is there a path back to being your father? Or am I permanently relegated to business acquaintance status? The question hung in the air. 20 years of hurt concentrated into a few honest words. Sarah felt David's hand find hers under the table, a quiet reminder that she wasn't navigating this alone. I don't know, she answered truthfully. The father I needed 20 years ago made a choice that can't be undone. Whether there's space for the father you might become now, that depends on who you prove to be going forward. Fair enough, Robert said quietly. James gathered the documents. These agreements can be modified as relationships evolve. Nothing here is carved in stone except the commitment to honest communication and mutual respect. As they signed the various papers establishing their new arrangements, Sarah felt something shift in her chest. Not forgiveness exactly, and certainly not a return to what had been, but possibility. Space for something entirely new to grow from the ashes of what they'd all lost. One more thing, she said as they prepared to leave. We're all different people than we were 20 years ago. Let's not pretend otherwise. Let's get to know who we actually are now. Margaret smiled through tears. I'd like that very much. 6 months later, Sarah stood in her kitchen, watching David arrange flowers in the center of their dining room table. The November evening carried the crisp promise of winter, and warm light spilled from their townhouse windows onto Beacon Hill's cobblestone streets. For the first time in 21 years, the Morrison family would gather under her roof. You're nervous, David observed, adjusting a chrysanthemum with the same precision he applied to surgical device calibrations. Terrified, Sarah corrected, checking the roast for the third time in 10 minutes. What if this is a mistake? What if we're all just pretending we've changed? Then we'll know that too. David's calm presence had anchored her through 6 months of tentative family reconstruction. But Sarah, look at what's already happened. She had to admit the evidence was encouraging. Michael's quarterly review at Morrison Pharmaceuticals had shown genuine progress, not just in understanding the science, but in earning respect from colleagues who'd watched the company's decline under his previous leadership. Dr. Martinez had specifically praised his willingness to admit ignorance and ask questions. Margaret's medical humanities program had exceeded all expectations. Her integration of art therapy with cardiac rehabilitation had caught the attention of 3 major medical centers seeking to license the approach. More importantly, she'd found her voice in ways that surprised everyone, including herself. Even Robert had proven valuable as a consultant, his regulatory expertise helping Thompson Medical navigate FDA approvals for new device applications. He'd also done something unprecedented, apologized publicly to Morrison Pharmaceuticals employees for the company's decline, taking full responsibility for strategic failures. The doorbell chimed, and Sarah felt her stomach tighten. Through the window, she could see her family gathered on the front steps, like uncertain visitors, rather than returning relatives. Margaret carried a small wrapped package. Michael had brought flowers. Robert stood slightly apart, his posture careful and respectful. Deep breath, David murmured, squeezing her hand before going to open the door. Mrs. Morrison-Thompson, Michael said formally as he entered, offering the flowers with a shy smile. Thank you for having us. The formal address made Sarah wince slightly. They were still navigating the complexity of names, relationships, expectations. Some evenings he called her Sarah. Others, when emotion overtook caution, he slipped into calling her Sis. Tonight's formality suggested his own nervousness. Just Sarah is fine, Michael. We're family, remember? Margaret's hug lasted longer than previous visits, her embrace carrying months of carefully rebuilt affection. "These are for you," she said, offering the wrapped package. "Nothing elaborate, just something I thought you might like." Inside, Sarah found a small watercolor painting, their townhouse as seen from across the street, painted with loving attention to detail. "Mom, this is beautiful. I painted it from memory after our first dinner here. I wanted to capture." Margaret paused, searching for words. "I wanted to remember what coming home felt like again." Robert entered last, moving with the careful dignity he'd maintained throughout their reconciliation process. "Sarah. David. Thank you for this." The first hour passed with the careful politeness of people still learning each other's boundaries. They discussed safe topics: Michael's latest research project, Margaret's upcoming gallery showing, Robert's consulting work with a pharmaceutical startup. David shared stories from recent medical conferences, and Sarah described her work on new cardiac device applications. But gradually, as wine relaxed formalities and shared stories built connection, the conversation deepened. Michael talked about his sobriety journey with surprising openness, acknowledging how alcohol had been his escape from inadequacy and fear. Margaret described rediscovering her artistic passion after decades of suppressing it for corporate wife expectations. "I spent 40 years being who I thought Robert Morrison's wife should be," she admitted. "I forgot who Margaret actually was underneath all those expectations." "I spent 20 years being angry about that," Sarah replied. "Angry that you wouldn't stand up to him, wouldn't fight for me. I didn't understand how hard it is to find your voice when you've been trained to be silent." Robert, who'd been unusually quiet, finally spoke. "I trained everyone in this family to be silent except me. My voice was the only one that mattered, and it led us all into darkness." The admission created space for deeper honesty. Sarah found herself describing the loneliness of building success without family to share it, the way achievement felt hollow when the people who'd shaped her couldn't witness her growth. David talked about feeling like he'd stolen Sarah from her family, carrying guilt about their rejection for 20 years. Rachel Thompson's arrival for dessert brought fresh energy and perspective. David's sister had become the bridge between biological and chosen family, her social worker's skills helping everyone navigate emotional complexity. "You know what I love about this?" Rachel said, surveying the dinner table where chocolate cake crumbs mixed with honest conversation. "Nobody's pretending this is easy or perfect. You're all just showing up and doing the work." As the evening wound down, Robert asked for a private moment with Sarah. They stepped onto the small balcony overlooking the garden, November air sharp against their faces. "I need to tell you something," he said quietly. "Watching you tonight, seeing the woman you became, the marriage you built, the success you earned, I understand now what I threw away 20 years ago. Not just my daughter, but the chance to witness something extraordinary." Sarah felt tears threaten. "Dad, I can't undo the past. I can't give you back the father you needed when you were 22. But if you'll let me, I'd like to try being the father you deserve now." Later, as Sarah and David cleaned dishes side by side, she reflected on the evening's quiet miracle. Not the dramatic reconciliation of movies or novels, but something more precious. The patient, imperfect work of people who'd chosen to try again. "Think they'll keep showing up?" David asked, drying the last wine glass. Sarah looked around their dining room, still warm with conversation and shared laughter. "I think we all will." Outside, snow began to fall, covering Beacon Hill in pristine white. Inside, a family that had learned to love imperfectly was learning to forgive the same way, one difficult, necessary conversation at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.